Officer Jack Murphy would never forget that night. After 10 years of service in the police force, he thought he had seen it all. But what happened on October 15th forever changed his view of the world and his own work. Jack's shift started as usual. He was patrolling the quiet suburban streets when he received a call about suspicious activity in an abandoned house on Oak Street. Neighbors reported strange noises and lights in the windows. Jack arrived at the scene first. The house looked dilapidated. Cracked paint, broken windows, a yard overgrown with weeds. But something was off. Jack could feel it in his bones. He slowly approached the front door, keeping his hand on his holster. Suddenly, he heard a muffled scream from inside the house. Without hesitation, Jack kicked down the door and burst inside. His flashlight beam caught glimpses of tattered wallpaper and scattered furniture in the darkness. The scream repeated, louder now. It was coming from the basement. Descending the creaky stairs, Jack froze. In the dim light, he saw a woman tied to a chair. Her eyes widened in horror when she noticed the officer. But before Jack could do anything, something heavy struck him on the head. The world swam before his eyes, and he lost consciousness. When Jack came to, he realized he was also tied to a chair. The sane woman sat next to him, her gaze empty and detached. In front of them stood a man in a bloody apron, holding a large butcher knife. "Ah, our guest has awakened," the man smiled. "Now we can begin the show." The next few hours became the most horrifying in Jack's life. He was forced to watch as the psychopath slowly dismembered the woman, reveling in her screams. Jack tried to look away, but the man forced him to watch, threatening to gouge out his eyes. When only bloody pieces remained of the woman, the man turned to Jack. "Your turn, officer," he whispered, approaching with the knife. But at that moment, sirens were heard upstairs. Backup had finally arrived. The psychopath's face contorted with fury. He lunged at Jack with the knife, but the officer managed to topple over in his chair and dodge the blow. When the police burst into the basement, they found Jack pinning the attacker to the floor, despite numerous cuts. The psychopath was arrested, but the horrors of that night stayed with Jack forever. The investigation revealed that the man was a serial killer wanted in 3 states. The remains of 5 more victims were found in the basement. Jack received a commendation for bravery, but no award could erase the memories of that night. Months passed. Jack returned to duty, but something in him had changed. He became more withdrawn, constantly checking locks and regarding strangers with suspicion. Night terrors plagued him, causing him to wake up in cold sweats. One day, while patrolling familiar streets, Jack received a call about suspicious activity in an abandoned house. His heart stopped. The address was the same, Oak Street. Jack knew the house had been demolished after that horrible incident. But when he arrived at the scene, the house stood there as if it had never disappeared, just as abandoned, with broken windows and overgrown yard. With trembling hands, Jack reached for the radio to call for backup. But the device emitted only static noise. His mobile phone wasn't working either. Jack was left alone with the house from his nightmares. He knew he had to enter. It was his duty. But each step was an immense effort. As he climbed onto the porch, Jack heard the familiar muffled scream from the basement. The door opened with a creak. Inside, everything looked exactly as he remembered. Jack slowly descended into the basement, feeling his heart ready to burst out of his chest. In the basement, the sane man in a bloody apron was waiting for him. "Welcome back, officer," he smiled, raising the knife. "I knew you'd return. You couldn't leave your job unfinished, could you?" Jack screamed, but his cry was swallowed by the darkness of the basement. He realized he could never escape the horrors of the past. They would always be waiting for him, ready to drag him back into the nightmare. The next morning, Jack's patrol car was found abandoned near an empty field where the house on Oak Street once stood. The officer himself was nowhere to be found. The police searched the entire area but found no traces. The case of Officer Jack Murphy's disappearance was never solved. But sometimes, local residents report seeing a solitary figure in a police uniform wandering the streets at night, as if searching for something. And each time, this figure vanishes as soon as it approaches the place where that terrible house on Oak Street once stood. This story became a local legend, told to police rookies. It reminds them of the dark side of their job, and that some horrors never let go, even of the bravest. Detective Sarah Lane would never forget that call. After 15 years of service in the Boston Police Department, she thought she had seen it all. But the case that began on November 3rd would forever change her view of the world and her own work. It all started with a routine report of strange noises in an old Victorian house on the outskirts of the city. Neighbors complained about knocking and rustling sounds coming from the walls of the building at night. At first, Sarah didn't pay much attention to it. Old houses often make strange noises, but when complaints continued to come in for a week, she decided to check it out personally. The house looked abandoned, with cracked paint and boarded-up windows. Sarah knocked on the door, but no one answered. She walked around the building, trying to find the source of the noise the neighbors had mentioned. Suddenly, she heard a faint knocking coming from inside the wall. Sarah called for backup and obtained a search warrant. When they entered the house, they were met with a scene of desolation and ruin. Dust covered the furniture in thick layers, cobwebs hung from the ceiling. But what was most striking was that all the walls were covered with strange drawings and inscriptions, seemingly made in blood. The team began to methodically search each room, listening for the slightest noise. In the basement, they found the first evidence that someone was living in the house: food scraps and a dirty mattress. But the most terrifying thing awaited them in the attic. When Sarah climbed the stairs, she was met with a horrible stench. On the attic floor lay 3 corpses in various stages of decomposition. But that wasn't what shocked the detective the most. In the far corner of the room, she noticed movement. Shining her flashlight in that direction, Sarah saw a woman huddled against the wall. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes wildly gleaming. In her hand, she held a large kitchen knife, covered in dried blood. The woman lunged at Sarah with an inhuman scream. The detective barely managed to dodge the knife blow. A struggle ensued, during which Sarah received several deep cuts, but she managed to subdue the attacker and handcuff her. Further investigation revealed a horrifying story. The woman's name was Emily Rogers. She was a former patient of a psychiatric hospital who had escaped 6 months ago. Emily suffered from a severe form of schizophrenia and believed that demons living in the walls of the house were ordering her to kill. The 3 corpses in the attic turned out to be homeless people whom Emily had lured into the house and brutally murdered. But the worst was yet to come. When the police began to tear down the walls, they discovered 5 more bodies embedded in the masonry. Emily believed that this was how she sealed the demons in the walls. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they had barely arrived in time. If they hadn't responded to the neighbors' complaints, how many more victims could this insane woman have claimed? The Emily Rogers case became one of the most high-profile in Boston's history. Sarah gave numerous interviews and testified in court as the key witness, but the horrors of that house haunted her for a long time. She couldn't forget Emily's crazed look, the smell of decay in the attic, the feeling of cold fingers of a corpse when she accidentally touched it during the search. Nightmares plagued Sarah at night, causing her to wake up in cold sweats. A few months after the case was closed, Sarah received an anonymous letter. The envelope contained only a sheet of paper with the words, "They are still here." The handwriting was exactly the same as the inscriptions on the walls of that horrible house. Sarah immediately reported this to her superiors. A check was conducted at the psychiatric hospital where Emily was being held, but it turned out that the patient was in place and had no access to means of communication. The detective tried to convince herself that it was just someone's cruel joke, but doubts wouldn't leave her alone. What if Emily was telling the truth? What if there really was something supernatural in those walls? Sarah began to notice strange things in her own house. Sometimes she thought she heard whispers from the walls. Things moved when she turned away. And once she woke up at night and saw a dark figure standing in the corner of the bedroom. When Sarah turned on the light, there was no one there. Colleagues began to notice changes in the detective's behavior. She became irritable, paranoid, constantly looking over her shoulder. Sarah began to conduct her own investigation, trying to find a connection between Emily's house and other cases of paranormal activity in the city. Her obsession with this case began to affect her work. The superiors sent Sarah on forced leave, recommending that she see a psychologist. But the detective couldn't stop. She was sure she was close to uncovering something important. One evening, Sarah returned to that same house on the outskirts of the city. It stood empty and abandoned, surrounded by police tape. The detective knew she shouldn't be doing this, but the need to find answers was stronger than common sense. She climbed over the fence and entered the house through a broken window. Inside, everything remained the same as on the day of the search. Sarah slowly climbed to the attic, feeling her heart ready to jump out of her chest. In the room where they had found the corpses, there was still a faint smell of decay. Sarah shone her flashlight on the walls covered with eerie drawings. Suddenly, she thought the figures in the drawings moved. The detective took a step back, and at that moment, the floor beneath her creaked. Before Sarah could react, the boards gave way, and she fell down. The impact with the floor below knocked the wind out of her. When Sarah came to, she realized she was in some hidden room between floors. The flashlight beam revealed a horrifying picture. The walls were covered with fresh blood, and in the center of the room stood an altar made of human bones. Sarah tried to get up but realized her leg was stuck between the boards. At that moment, she heard a whisper that grew louder with each second. The shadows on the walls began to move, taking on eerie shapes. The detective screamed, but her cry was drowned out by a chorus of voices coming from nowhere. The last thing Sarah saw before losing consciousness was Emily Rogers' face emerging from the darkness with a diabolical smile. The next day, the police found Sarah's car parked near the abandoned house. But the detective herself was nowhere to be found. Extensive searches yielded no results. The only clue was an inscription on the attic wall, made in blood. "Now she is one of us." The case of Detective Sarah Lane's disappearance was never solved. But sometimes, local residents report seeing a female figure in the windows of that terrible house, and each time the police respond to a call, they find nothing but dust and cobwebs. This story became a grim legend in the Boston Police Department. It reminds officers that sometimes the most terrifying evil hides not in dark alleys or abandoned houses, but in the depths of the human mind and in the shadows we are afraid to see. Officer Michael Carter had been with the Chicago Police Department for over a decade, but nothing in his career had prepared him for the events of that fateful night. It was a cool autumn evening when the call came in. Reports of strange noises and suspicious activity at an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of the city. As Michael pulled up to the dilapidated Victorian mansion, he felt an immediate sense of unease. The house loomed before him, its windows dark and empty, like hollow eyes staring into the night. The overgrown yard and peeling paint gave the impression that no one had lived there for years, yet neighbors had reported seeing lights and hearing voices coming from inside. Michael called for backup before approaching the house. As he walked up the creaking steps of the front porch, he heard a faint scratching sound coming from within the walls. It was barely audible, but unmistakably there, like something or someone was moving inside the very structure of the house. The front door was unlocked, swinging open with an ominous creak. The beam of Michael's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing an interior covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. The air was heavy with the musty smell of decay and something else, a metallic scent that made Michael's stomach turn. As he moved deeper into the house, the scratching sounds grew louder. They seemed to be coming from all around him now, within every wall. Michael's training told him to wait for backup, but something compelled him to press on. He found himself in what must have once been a grand living room, now a shell of its former glory. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked behind him. Michael spun around, his hand on his weapon, to find himself face to face with a woman. Her wild, matted hair hung in tangles around a gaunt face, and her eyes gleamed with an unnatural light in the beam of his flashlight. In her hand, she clutched a large kitchen knife, its blade dark with what looked horribly like dried blood. Before Michael could react, the woman lunged at him with inhuman speed, the knife slashing through the air. He barely managed to dodge the attack, feeling the blade whistle past his face. As he stumbled backward, his foot caught on something on the floor. A body, he realized with horror. In the split second his attention was diverted, the woman was on him again. They grappled in the darkness, Michael fighting to keep the knife away from his throat. The woman's strength was incredible, fueled by a manic energy that seemed beyond human. As they struggled, Michael became aware of movement all around them. To his horror, he saw hands emerging from the walls. Pale, skeletal hands reaching out from between the wooden slats. With a surge of adrenaline, Michael managed to overpower the woman, knocking the knife from her hand and pinning her to the ground. As he handcuffed her, she began to laugh. A chilling, inhuman sound that echoed through the empty house. "You're too late," she hissed. "They're already here." As if on cue, the walls began to splinter and crack. Pale, emaciated figures started to emerge from within the very structure of the house. Their faces were gaunt and hollow, eyes sunken and lifeless. Michael realized with growing horror that these were not living people, but corpses, somehow animated and moving with jerky, unnatural motions. Michael dragged the still laughing woman out of the house, his mind reeling from what he had seen. As they reached the porch, his backup finally arrived, their sirens cutting through the night. Michael tried to explain what he had witnessed, but the words caught in his throat. When the other officers entered the house, they found no trace of the moving corpses. Instead, they discovered something perhaps even more horrifying. Hidden passages honeycombed the walls of the old house, narrow crawl spaces barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. And within these secret spaces, they found bodies, dozens of them, in various states of decay. Men, women, children, all crammed into the walls of the house, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. The woman, they learned, was Sandra Morrow, a former psychiatric patient who had been missing for months. She babbled about voices in the walls, about demons that demanded sacrifices. But no matter how much she was questioned, she couldn't or wouldn't explain how she had managed to hide so many victims within the house without anyone noticing. As the investigation unfolded over the following weeks, more horrifying details came to light. Many of the victims had been alive when they were sealed into the walls, slowly suffocating or starving to death in the dark, cramped spaces. The most recent victims might have still been alive when Michael first entered the house, their feeble scratching at the walls being the sounds he had heard. The case became a media sensation, with reporters dubbing it the House of Living Walls. But for Michael, the horrors of that night were far from over. He couldn't shake the memory of what he had seen, the corpses moving, reaching out from the walls. None of the other officers had witnessed it, and Michael began to doubt his own sanity. Nightmares plagued him, filled with visions of pale hands reaching for him from dark spaces, of walls that breathed and pulsed with hidden life. He became obsessed with the case, poring over every detail, convinced that there was more to the story than a simple, albeit horrific, series of murders. Michael's behavior became erratic. He started seeing things out of the corner of his eye, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, faces peering at him from cracks in the walls. His colleagues grew concerned, suggesting he take some time off, see a therapist. But Michael couldn't let it go. Months after the initial discovery, Michael found himself drawn back to the abandoned house. It stood empty now, surrounded by police tape, its dark windows seeming to watch him as he approached. He knew he shouldn't be there, that he was jeopardizing his career, but he was convinced that the answers he sought lay within those walls. As he stepped inside, the old floorboards creaking under his feet, Michael felt a sense of dread wash over him. The house seemed different somehow, alive in a way that defied explanation. The walls pulsed faintly, as if breathing. And from deep within the structure, he heard a familiar sound, the faint scratching of something moving in the walls. Michael's flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. He fumbled for his phone, trying to call for backup, but there was no signal. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw movement in the shadows. Pale figures emerged from the walls, their hollow eyes fixed upon him. Among them, he recognized faces from crime scene photos, victims whose bodies had been removed months ago. As the figures closed in around him, Michael heard Sandra Morrow's voice echoing through the house. "Now you're one of us." He tried to run, but the floorboards beneath his feet suddenly gave way. Michael fell into darkness, surrounded by the sound of splintering wood and inhuman whispers. The next day, when Michael failed to report for duty, his fellow officers went looking for him. They traced his last known movements to the abandoned house on the outskirts of town. But when they arrived, they found no sign of Michael. The house stood silent and empty, its secrets once again hidden behind crumbling walls. Weeks turned into months, and despite an extensive investigation, no trace of Officer Michael Carter was ever found. The case of the House of Living Walls was officially closed, filed away as one of those inexplicable tragedies that sometimes occur in law enforcement. But late at night, when the wind howls and shadows seem to move of their own accord, some say you can still hear faint noises coming from the old house on the hill, the sound of scratching within the walls, and the muffled cries of those who have become a part of the house's grim collection. And if you look closely at the darkened windows, you might just catch a glimpse of a face, the haunted eyes of Officer Michael Carter, forever trapped within the living walls, a testament to the horrors that lurk in the darkest corners of our world.